Okay, it is time to talk about our second to last literary time period, and that is modernism. So let's start with our dates. So modernism is basically between the end of World War One, or the beginning of World War One, excuse me, to the beginning of World War Two. So you're talking about 1914 to about 1939, 1940, in that area there. And remember, we taught about this with Romanticism, that these aren't hard dates. The trends kind of come and go and they overlap and flow together often. So this is a literary time period that gets its inspiration or its beginning from World War One. So let's just talk a little bit about World War One and why it was so impactful in changing people's worldview. So you might remember that World War One was called the Great War or the War to End All Wars for a couple of reasons. One, people had not seen warfare on this scale before. So I have a little map up there that just kind of shows you um, the the breadth of land and countries, etc., that was involved in World War One. It's also a war in which we see innovations, for lack of a better word, um, about warfare. So here you see a picture of both soldiers and dogs wearing gas masks in the trenches. So trench warfare was a relatively new thing. Using biological warfare, mustard gas, for example, is new here. We also have tanks used in warfare for the first time, machine guns used in warfare for the first time. So basically, World War One is a war in which we got really efficient, unfortunately, at killing each other on a mass scale. And just one more picture. This never shows up quite as well um, as I want on a PowerPoint, but this is a soldier who has been burned by mustard gas. You can see that the skin on his chest is much paler than the skin on his burned arm and his neck and his face. So this would have been somebody who was caught by that gas unawares, and all of his exposed skin is burned. So this war was dramatic, for lack of a better term, and obviously very, very deadly. So it ushered in this time period of modernism, and modernism is one of these literary periods that goes so far beyond literature and art to really talk about your average person and how they're viewing the world. Now, naturalism did too with the influence of Darwin and Freud, um, but we're taking even a step further from naturalism when we look at modernism. I would say that modernism is a time period where there's a lot of disillusionment. In fact, three words that we use to talk about modernism is alienation, fragmentation, and isolation. If these things aren't literal, then they are figurative and they show up all over the place, especially in the literature. So what I have here pictured for you is labeled The Descent of the Modernists. I know my picture's over it a little bit, but you see people beginning at the top of the stairs, and each little bit of Christianity that they let go of leads them down this modernist direction. So you have people thinking, well, maybe the Bible is not infallible. Maybe man is not made in God's image. Maybe there are no miracles and no virgin birth. All of these things would have been, in all of these ideas would have been impacted by Darwin's work, not just Darwin's work, but largely his work. And if all of these things are true, maybe there is no deity at all. And if there's no deity, maybe I can't atone for my sins. Maybe there's no resurrection, leading to agnosticism and finally atheism. So I just want you to be aware that this is a literary period that is so much more than literature, and we're still seeing the impact of modernism today. And if you look at the picture of the guy at the bottom stair, I don't know if he's intended to look like Freud, but he does look like Freud quite a bit. And of course, he is, instrumental in bringing about some of these ideas. So let's keep going, and you have to replace your old sense of reality with something new. If you give up believing in something, you automatically pick up believing in something else. So the new sense of reality here in modernism, people are replacing a belief in an absolute truth, that there is a standard for what is true, what has happened, what has not happened. They let go of that and they start to believe in multiple relative truths with an S. So instead of truth with a capital T, they now believe and that truth is relative, that everybody can have their own version of truth. And again, we still deal with that thought today when we hear people saying, "I'm just speaking my truth." Well, as Christians, we will say, well, there is a truth, speaking your truth, it's either true or it's not. So this idea that there are multiple truths leads to this thought that maybe reality, quote unquote, is a constructed fiction. So you might hear people talking about history being the story of the majority, and there are other stories in there. And that's true in many ways, but that does not mean that all of reality is a constructed truth, the way we might study history books as a constructed truth. All right, so in art, you see less emphasis on the artist's reflection of external reality, which is exactly what realists would have done, right? This is what I see, so this is what I'm going to write, this is what I'm going to paint, etc. And there's a greater emphasis on the artist's reflection of the perceiving mind, meaning there's this acknowledgement that what I put on this canvas, what I put on this in this story, is what I see as being reality, not necessarily what you would see as reality. So to kind of emphasize that as far as art is concerned, if you look at these two famous paintings, the first one is called, on the left, is called Whistler's Mother. And it is a realist work, and Whistler's mother probably looked a lot like this. So this artist is painting his mother against this backdrop. It is very conceivable that she lives in this house, that this is what she wears on a daily basis, and this is how he looks. So the artist isn't talking about his perception of a mother, he's talking about, or he's painting his literal mother. Now the picture you see on the right is by an artist, Henri Matisse, and he's part of this modernism movement. And he might also, I'm sorry, I forgot the name of this painting, but he could also very well be painting a similar scene as to Whistler's mother. There's a woman in a house, there is a table and a chair, and that is either a window in the upper left-hand corner, or maybe it's also a painting. But we can see that this does not depict reality, right? So he may have been using a model, setting a table here and standing beside her window in her dining area. But we don't have the expectation that if we saw that model, that if we saw that room, that it would literally look like this. So they're no longer focusing on literal representation or verisimilitude. They're now focusing on their own perspective. What do I see when I look at this woman, when I look at this room? And that is what they're trying to convey rather than the truth. Okay, so let's talk about a whole section of artists, and I'm sorry that we're not reading any of these artists. This happens to be my favorite literary period, and artists who are in the lost generation tend to be some of my favorite artists. but we read a lot of them in American literature, and we do try to differentiate American literature from multicultural literature as much as we can. So the Lost Generation refers to mostly American writers of the 1920s who were responsible for bringing modernism back to the United States. So many of these artists and writers were involved in World War I in some way, shape, and form. They fought, or they reported, or in the case of Ernest Hemingway, he was an ambulance driver. So many of them saw the immediate impact of battle and war face to face right in front of them. We're starting to, well, I'll hold off on that. So another thing, World War I destroyed this illusion that acting virtuously brought on something good, that if you were a good person, good things came to you. And we did see naturalism kind of letting go of this, but this is to a further extent. I don't think that modernism is as pessimistic as naturalism is. There seems to be a lot more confusion and disillusionment with modernism. These are people who thought they understood the way the world worked, and then they went to Europe, got involved in World War I in some way, shape, or form, and did not know how to go back to regular society. And that is what many people still in the United States who did not go overseas expected. Men have been involved in war for generations and generations. Why can't you just come back and rejoin society normally? And we know from the literature, from history, from many other sources, that that's just not what happened in World War I. They were starting to learn a little more about battle fatigue, which we would now call PTSD. There are some truly unsettling pictures online if you Google that, either battle shock or battle fatigue. And they're just starting to recognize that this is a valid concern for soldiers, that they have gone through something traumatic, and that is going to fundamentally change them. And a lot of these writers bringing back modernism discuss or kind of reveal that just because the war is over does not mean that they are no longer impacted by it. So we're going to continue. Okay, so writers of this period do get more experimental. They take a few things that have maybe been played with in the past and really go after them. And this is a reaction to a lot of radical developments, a lot of changes. So you're not expected to know these on your test, but I do want to just kind of emphasize all the things that are taking place during and right after World War I. It's just a massive amount of change. So emerging fields of psychology and sociology that are now making claims about human behavior and about society that people haven't thought of before. New theories of electromagnetism, quantum physics, and that is some of the work, some of the scientific discoveries that led to the creation and the use of the atomic bomb in World War II. Growing critique of British imperialism. So we talked about there being a time period in which the sun never set on the British Empire. And people are now looking at the British involvement around the world and saying, that's not right. And there are countries that the British have conquered and colonized, saying we don't really need or want you here. We had our own culture and government before you showed up. Doctrines of racial superiority in Germany get their start during World War I. If you know anything about Hitler's biography, it was a bitterness over World War I, looking for someone to blame, that led to his thoughts and statements that he made to get Germany kind of on his side prior to World War II. So obviously escalation of warfare to a global level, shifting power structures. You have women entering the workforce en masse. because there simply weren't men to do the jobs. The men were at war, so somebody had to do them, and women got those jobs. And it was the normal kind of stuff, but then it was also stuff related to, sorry, that's a very professional word, isn't it? Stuff. Jobs related to warfare, you know, munitions and things of that nature. And then when men come home and need work, it's difficult for women to step back and say, oh, okay, well, if a man's here, then I guess he should do this job that I've been doing capably for several years now. So there's a shift in the power structure there. So new information technologies, radio and cinema, are really growing, and then the rise of mass communication. News is traveling faster than it ever has before. And if any of your mass comm majors, this is kind of when your major was able to get started, when people were able to reach a massive amount of people quickly. All right, let's continue. So the style and method of modernist writing. Now we could talk about art and other things, and that's a completely different conversation. But what we see in the literature is the plot is less linear, meaning it's not always chronological. This happens, and then this happens, and then this happens. Sometimes it's all mixed up. Sometimes there are shifts from one setting to another, one conversation to another, without a clear delineation, like a new chapter or something like that. Resolutions become less clear as well. So if you think about that plot diagram, that's that pyramid, it lays them out all pretty equally, and that is less likely to happen in modernism. We already talked about introductions often being shortened with short stories because of the word space. So it's starting in media res often. And what often happens with the resolution, the further you get into these literary periods, the more contemporary the literature is, sometimes the less satisfying the resolution is. Sometimes there's really not a resolution, and you're left wondering, wait, what happened? What was I supposed to understand for that? Or it does have an ending, and the ending is just not comforting. It's just not something that we like or want to hear. It's not quite as grim, again, as naturalism, but sometimes it can leave you unsettled, or like the story just isn't finished. All right, so next let's talk about style. There are several things I could say, but for what we're reading, the Jilting of Granny Weatherall, one of the key styles is stream of consciousness. Now, stream of consciousness is tracing a nonlinear thought process. What that means is that the author is attempting to take what happens in the brain and put it on paper. It's kind of like having a conversation with a friend, and suddenly you're wondering, how do we even get on this topic? Or you realize you've been driving around the road 20 minutes and you don't really remember where you've been on automatic, and your brain has just been going. Stream of consciousness is similar to that. Now, we can't literally replicate what our brain does. Our brain is just too busy doing stuff and having thoughts for us to be able to identify them individually and put them on paper. So this style of stream of consciousness can be a little confusing because you don't have kind of that connective tissue between thoughts. It's difficult sometimes to figure out who's having the conversation, who's talking, or when somebody is thinking. And again, that's what you'll see with the Jilting of Granny Weatherall. And then point of view, you have a rejection of the single authoritative, omniscient point of view. So whereas in realism, you often did get kind of an objective third-person picture, that's less likely to happen in modernism because everybody can have their own truth, right? Everybody can have their own understanding and interpretation of what's happening. So with the Jilting of Granny Weatherall, what you have is this woman with either dementia or Alzheimer's who is on her deathbed. And you're getting in the stream of consciousness style, in the first person point of view, how she is dealing with that and how she is viewing what's going on around her as she approaches death. All right, so let me just show you a few authors and works that you might be familiar with that are part of this literary period. So all of these, well, the first two I would say are definitely part of the Lost Generation. The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway, who I also mentioned with naturalism. The Sun Also Rises is an excellent depiction of modernism in literature. And the last person I have listed there, so Catherine Ann Porter wrote The Jilting of Granny Weatherall. And then last, Franz Kafka. You might be most familiar with Metamorphosis. Talks about this man, Gregor Samsa, who wakes up one morning as a giant bug. And the story is about how he and his family deal with the fact that he is suddenly a giant beetle or some kind of giant bug. You may have read that in the past. But we are going to read another piece by him, and that is The Hunger Artist. It's the last short story we do. And I just want you to know for test purposes that even though we're reading Kafka last, he does fit in this modernist time period. As we go through the last two literary periods, our authors get a little jumbled, so we're kind of moving by theme. But I want you to know Catherine Ann Porter and The Jilting of Granny Weatherall, Franz Kafka, with The Story of an Hour. Both of those go with modernism. All right, so I'm going to stop here and move on to my next lecture, which will be about The Jilting of Granny Weatherall.